Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about The Trouble with Humanitarianism by Roberto Belloni, and we're going to compare with Michael Doyle's text, The Politics of Global Humanitarianism, the responsibility to protect before and after Libya. First, we're going to go through the table of context, giving a brief background for a further understanding. Then we're going to talk about Belloni's categories comparing to Doyle's statements. We're going to give a brief takeaway of the analysis made and going to talk about the references. So for the background, according to the Westphalian system, states are sovereign with authority over the territory under their jurisdiction. But humanitarianism allows individuals and groups to play a crucial role internationally speaking, which used to be the role of states prior humanitarianism. But these principles were only recognized by international law after some tipping points. The first one is the 1864 Geneva Convention. This convention gave three guiding principles for ICRC. The first one is humanity, that talks about the desire to help the victims regardless any political constraint. The second one, impartiality, that concerns itself with the needs and the vulnerability of the victims. And neutrality, referring to political involvement and not taking sides between the parties. However, it wasn't until the end of the Second World War that humanitarianism had its comeback, with, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was a warning call to the whole world not to reproduce the mistakes made by Europe on previous years, and the emergence of new actors at Médecins Sans Frontières. Meanwhile, Doyle sees the states as sovereign in domestic affairs, but that cannot commit crimes against humanity. And he also addresses the United Nations for the institutionalization of responsibility to protect and not previous milestones, as Belloni did with the Geneva Convention. Bellini states that humanitarianism has supporters, critics, and enemies. The ones in favor highlight it as a sign of progress towards human freedom. Critics denounce issues as the misuse of humanitarian aid. However, enemies criticize it for being a moral cover for the interest of the most powerful states. But Doyle divides them in two. The ones that fear neo-imperialism, therefore try to reduce global protection or humanitarianism, and the ones that want humanitarianism to increase, even when they doubt the effectiveness of the UN system processes. But Doyle sees humanitarianism as an ideology. He says that there are many ideas, but it's still ineffective and counterproductive. And he argues this in four different categories with different theses that are going to be explained further by my colleagues and I. So the first category is humanitarian worldview. And the first thesis is humanitarianism simplifies too much. So, humanitarianism portrays a very simple world where individuals are victims or perpetrators, and not just instead people behaving. So once the West is fulfilled by their actions, they will use militarily actions to allegedly protect human rights. And media coverage contributes to the simplification of the reality, using cine Dutch, that is, to take a part of the whole. So basically, they decide to make someone a victim just by choosing which part of the story to tell. Humanitarianism tries to get empathy for people to support humanitarian interventions. However, Doyle sees different scenarios with different actors and not just what media is showing. The second thesis states that humanitarianism misinterprets reality and delays effective intervention. Human crises result out of different processes and don't appear suddenly. It takes time for them to arise. And most of the time, they can be detected even before they happen. But humanitarianism is not about prevention, but about damage control. And an example is Rwanda's case, where even though rapporteurs from the United Nations filled down reports on civilians' deaths, these deaths were not stopped. However, later it was said that early deployment of troops would have prevented most of the killing. And something similar happened in Yugoslavia. And it all basically summarizes in the idea that some powerful countries pretend to act on behalf of human rights, but don't really commit to their defense because they don't want to choose when or how they are going to intervene. However, Doyle states three main points for international responsibility, which are prevent, react, and rebuild. But he also sees as a problem the fact that states don't know when to invoke the pillars of R2P, the same as Belloni is doing.
So for the negative consequences of coercion, as his third thesis, Belloni induces that humanitarianism itself creates or provokes minorities to raise the level of violence. To these ends, minority leaders, as he mentions, can be tempted to confront their oppressors to attract international sympathy and support by increasing the degree of violence in their actions. Copperman confirms this view, arguing that in Bosnia and Kosovo, the leaders of vulnerable groups escalated the conflict with the central authorities with the purpose of just attracting attention. The Western powers determined that intervention would have saved Kosovo, and that ethnic cleansing was not going to be tolerated by the international community. In the Kosovo's case, one of NATO's key reasons for intervening was that there was an evidence of a Serbian final solution or an extermination plan. However, there was zero evidence to prove that a plan like this ever existed. In Doyle's article, he mentions that when it comes to crimes against humanity, human solidarity calls out for rescue. In the World Summit Outcome document of 2005, head of states agreed on the invocation of the principle of the responsibility to protect. The Clinton-Blair doctrine towards the Kosovo crisis called for the assembly of a NATO peacekeeping force. In Clinton's words, it doesn't matter where in the world a situation that involves the egregious violations to the provisions stated in international law are happening. If there is something that can be done, it will be done. However, one can argue that Kofi Annan's declaration towards the military action taken by NATO created a dangerous precedent that could lead to the abuse of this protective principle in the future. The Kosovo Commission also had a similar point of view as Annan. It concluded that the intervention was illegal but legitimate. For the Darfur example, as it is mentioned in several occasions, the West powers will always come to rescue a society that is oppressed by their own government. The situation in the western region of Darfur illustrates the dangers that can manifest as a result of a humanitarian action, when a minority group increases violent actions to just attract attention. The Doyle's response to this Darfur crisis was to show the clear inaction from the international community. In this situation, many people were killed, but the international community never provided a concrete response to the crisis because the genocide criteria was never fulfilled. Because it could never be determined that the killings were directed towards a specific group, so in this case, nothing happened.
Regarding the prophylactic function and organization, the author states that humanitarianism is not altruistic. He argues that the ideal main function of humanitarianism is improving the human condition by changing the structure which allows human rights violations. However, the reality is that it serves the Western countries as a sedative which temporarily prevents political crises to impact their economies. For instance, the European strategy is to keep civilians in war zones. Why? Well, because humanitarian protection has been extended not just to refugees, but also to internally displaced people, and both groups are a social and a financial burden to the states that helps them. Humanitarian organizations that are supposed to be the immediate solution to crisis, they end up being like a fire brigade in the sense that they are better in relieving human suffering than tackling the core problem which led to the conflict in the first place. And they somehow safeguard Western countries' interests. But humanitarianism can sometimes come with a different name, such as intervention, invoking the responsibility to protect. Contrary to Bellini, Doyle thinks that further development and consensus on R2P could mitigate the consequences of war for civilian population, since it is a license to and a leash against forcible interventions. So RTP can mean a difference for, let's say, the civilian Syrian population because it could ease their suffering and somehow bring peace. As for the sixth thesis, the author mentions that humanitarianism is the short-term substitute of development. So humanitarianism is the way through which the Western developed world acknowledges that development aid has a significant limitation, as it is the case of Rwanda. Being considered a successful development aid industry in 1980s was the scenario of a genocide 14 years later. Furthermore, Belloni criticizes the double paradox of humanitarianism because countries more likely to receive aid are also the ones that need it the least, because they are the most accountable and transparent ones, while countries with poor governances and in need of the aid are not a priority because they are more likely to misuse the aid. Besides, the closer the source of instability to developed Western states, the more resources are needed for containment. So related to Doyle's text, he contemplates the possibility of invoking RTP to intervene to protect the population, but also changing a regime, maybe an inconvenient regime to the Western countries, as it was the case of Libya in 2018 in Gaddafi's regime. Regarding humanitarianism being organizationally dysfunctional, Belloni compares the dependence of NGOs of Western countries on donations to address humanitarian crises with the kiss of death. In this sense, NGOs are hand-tied because they operate with Western money, so Western interests are reflected in their humanitarian actions. This became obvious in the genocide in Rwanda, where dozens of humanitarian NGOs were on the field providing aid to victims, but also perpetrators of the genocide, without being able to differentiate them. Beyond this structural problem, the composition of international humanitarian staff is problematic since humanitarianism promotes impartiality through professionalization. But how is the staff supposed to help people in humanitarian crisis if they are detached from local reality? Instead of being accessible, it creates a social dichotomy between experts and population. According to Doyle, NGOs are hand-tied, but also states and international organizations. As it was the case of the Security Council resolution about humanitarian aid in 2014, which was denied by Assad's regime. Also, it is visible in the case of Libya with RTP. For RTP to be invoked, again, the interests of the permanent members of the Security Council and their allies should be aligned, but it is unlikely to happen.
Negative consequences of post-war humanitarianism. So for this case, Belloni argues that just the sole act of humanitarianism itself can further a conflict. So for this case, the misuse of aid is the main issue for this thesis. The misappropriation of aid is inevitable due to the amount of resources involved. The criminal use of this aid can help local leaders to increase their dominance across the affected territory. So as regards to this, and according to Fiona Terry, first, negotiation with local particular leaders to gain access to some areas. Second, the local leaders can steal and give this aid to strengthen their followers. Third, the legitimacy by international aid agencies. So most of the times these aid agencies have to negotiate the terms in which the aid is going to be delivered to the affected population, giving de facto recognition to these gangs. Fourth, aid agencies, by replacing the state in providing a sense of security to the population, can negatively impact the situation of these troubled areas. So, following the context of legitimizing war criminals by humanitarian action, we have that in the Rwandan case, the aid agencies relied on the local leaders to provide aid. However, most of these leaders were the same ones that in first place were in charge of the genocide. For the Somalia crisis and the US intervention, positive results were being obtained until the United States recognized Mohammed Farah Aidid and Ali Mahdi. And in the Balkan situations, the elections that were promoted to introduce a multi-ethnic government ended up empowering the same group that was against any ethnic conciliation.
So for the takeaway, on one side, Belloni shows himself very critical towards the legality and the social aspect involving the international community's perception vis-a-vis humanitarian intervention, while Doyle argues in favor of states intervening with humanitarian purposes. He is aware that there is not a clear guide for states to apply R2P and should be revised to avoid any misuse of it in the future. However, both agree on the fact that states act just on behalf of their own interests. Here are the references we use for this presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.